Hello everyone, wishing you all a wonderful day. Today we're diving into the hidden past that shaped everything. Why James's father is so determined to tear apart his son's love, all because of a heartbreak buried decades ago. What really happened between Mrs. Diep and Mr. Juan, and how is that old wound destroying James and Tu Diep's future? If you enjoy stories filled with secrets, emotion, and shocking truths, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any upcoming videos. There is a part of this story that almost no one talks about, a chapter buried so deeply in the past that even the people involved try to pretend it never existed. But if we're going to understand why everything is falling apart in the present, we have to go back to a time before the wealth, before the power, before the bitterness hardened into something unrecognizable. Years ago, Mrs. Diep and Mr. Juan were deeply in love. Not the kind of love built on convenience or status, but the kind that grows quietly between two young people who believe they can face the world together. Back then, Mr. Juan was poor. He didn't have influence, he didn't have connections, and he certainly didn't have money. What he had was sincerity. He loved Mrs. Diep with everything he had. He worked hard, he dreamed big, and he promised her that one day he would build a future where they would never have to bow their heads to anyone. And she believed him. They made plans together, whispered about a shared future, and held on to the idea that love alone would be enough. But reality has a way of testing promises. Mrs. Diep's family did not approve of Mr. Juan. To them, love without money was nothing more than a fragile illusion. They looked at him and saw poverty, instability, and a future filled with struggle. No matter how sincere he was, no matter how determined, he could not change the fact that he had nothing to offer in material terms. The pressure grew heavier with time. Conversations turned into arguments. Disapproval turned into outright opposition. In the end, Mrs. Diep made a decision that would change everything. She chose to break up with Mr. Juan and marry a wealthy man instead. Just like that, the future they had promised each other disappeared. Mr. Juan was left standing alone, not just heartbroken, but humiliated. In his eyes, it wasn't just a breakup. It was a rejection of who he was. It was proof that he was not enough. The pain did not fade. Instead, it transformed. Mr. Juan convinced himself that Mrs. Diep had betrayed him for money, that she had chosen comfort over love, that she had measured his worth in banknotes and found him lacking. Whether that belief was entirely true or not didn't matter anymore, because once it settled in his heart, it became his reality. And from that moment on, something inside him changed. He swore that he would never allow anyone to look down on him again. He would never be the poor man abandoned for someone richer. He threw himself into work with relentless intensity. He chased success not just for stability, but for revenge against the past. Every deal closed, every contract signed, every step up the ladder was fueled by a silent vow. He would become so powerful, so wealthy, that no one would ever dare to choose money over him again. Years passed. The world moved on. Mr. Juan succeeded beyond what anyone had expected. He built his empire, accumulated wealth, and earned the kind of respect that money commands. In the present, he is no longer the poor young man pleading for love. He is rich, he is powerful, he has influence, and he has a son, James, who is everything he once wished he could be at that age. James is accomplished, capable, and admired. He represents success in its most polished form. On the surface, it looks like Mr. Juan has won. He climbed out of humiliation and turned it into triumph. But victory does not erase old wounds. It only hides them under layers of achievement. Now look at the contrast. While Mr. Juan stands at the peak of wealth and authority, Tu Diep lives a life of hardship. She is poor, she struggles, her circumstances are modest, even difficult. The gap between the two families could not be clearer. And this is where the past begins to bleed into the present. Because Tu Diep is the daughter of Mrs. Diep, the same woman who once left Mr. Juan. To him, this is not coincidence. It feels like history repeating itself in a twisted mirror. His son is rich. The daughter of the woman who abandoned him is poor. And yet somehow they fall in love. To Mr. Huan, this is not romance. It is a threat. He cannot see Tu Diep as an individual. Instead, he sees her as an extension of her mother. He looks at her and thinks she must be the same. He convinces himself that just as Mrs. Dieu once chose wealth over love, Tu Diep must now be choosing love for the sake of wealth. In his mind, it is obvious. His son is successful and financially secure. Tu Diep comes from nothing. The conclusion he draws feels logical to him. She must be after James because of his assets, because of his status, because of everything Mr. Hon fought so hard to build. The fear that once consumed him resurfaces stronger than ever. He is terrified that his son will be used, discarded, humiliated the same way he was. And that fear slowly turns into something extreme. Mr. Huan does not respond calmly. He does not sit down to understand. Instead, he acts. He spreads negative rumors about Tu Diep, questioning her intentions and character. He uses money as leverage, attempting to buy distance, to create separation through pressure and influence. He manipulates situations, making it difficult for the two to meet, to talk, to breathe freely around each other. And when subtle tactics are not enough, he pushes harder. He forces James into an impossible choice: family or love, loyalty or independence, obedience or heartbreak. Every action he takes is rooted in one overwhelming fear: the fear of being betrayed again, the fear of watching history repeat itself, the fear that despite all his wealth, he still cannot protect what matters most. From the outside, Mr. Huan's actions may look cold, even cruel. People see a powerful man trying to control his son's heart, interfering in a relationship that should belong only to two young adults. But inside him, the story feels different. Every time he sees James standing beside Tu Diep, smiling in a way that reminds him of his own younger self, something twists in his chest. It is not just anger, it is memory. He remembers how certain he once felt, how convinced he was that love would be enough. He remembers the day that certainty shattered, and he cannot separate that memory from the present. To him, this is not a new story. It is a replay of an old one, and he refuses to let it end the same way. The more he watches them, the more convinced he becomes that Tu Diep is following the same path her mother once did, only in reverse. In his mind, Mrs. Dieu chose money over love. Now he believes Tu Diep is choosing love because of money. He sees patterns where others see coincidence. He connects dots that may not truly belong together. When he notices how modest Tu Diep's life is, how limited her resources are, it only strengthens his suspicion. He interprets her silence as calculation, her humility as strategy. He does not consider that she might simply be sincere, because acknowledging that possibility would mean admitting that his past pain may have distorted his judgment. James, meanwhile, stands at the center of this storm without fully understanding its origin. To him, Tu Diep is not a symbol of the past. She is not a reminder of an old wound. She is just the person he loves. He sees her kindness, her resilience, the way she carries her struggles without bitterness. He does not measure her in terms of status or background, but Mr. Huan does. Every time James defends her, every time he insists that her feelings are genuine, it feels to Mr. Huan like youthful blindness. He tells himself that he once spoke the same way, that he once believed just as strongly, and he paid for it, so he escalates. He uses his influence to create distance between them. Business opportunities suddenly require James's full attention, keeping him away. Social circles subtly close their doors to Tu Diep. Invitations disappear, whispers spread. It becomes harder and harder for their relationship to exist without tension. Mr. Huan convinces himself that he is protecting his son, that one day James will thank him for preventing a mistake. In private moments, however, there is a flicker of doubt, a quiet question he does not allow himself to explore. What if he is wrong? But fear is louder than doubt. The image that haunts him most is not of Tu Diep as she is now. It is of Mrs. Dieu turning away from him years ago. That image has never faded. It resurfaces whenever he feels vulnerable, and seeing his son vulnerable, open, devoted, emotionally invested, terrifies him. Wealth did not heal that old humiliation. Success did not erase the memory of being abandoned. It only gave him tools to avoid feeling powerless again. Now he uses those tools without hesitation. When he forces James to choose between family and love, it is not simply a test of loyalty. It is a desperate attempt to regain control over a situation that reminds him too much of his own loss of control. He frames it as responsibility, as wisdom, as experience speaking. But beneath all those justifications lies a simpler truth. He is afraid. Afraid that history will repeat itself. Afraid that his son will suffer the same heartbreak. Afraid that no matter how much money he has accumulated, he still cannot guarantee emotional security. The tragedy is that in trying to prevent pain, he may be creating it. The harder he pushes, the more resistance grows. The more he insists that Tu Diep must have hidden motives, the more James feels compelled to defend her. What began as suspicion slowly becomes a battle of wills, and at the center of it all is a wound from decades ago that was never truly healed. Mr. Juan does not see himself as the villain of this story. In his mind, he is the man who learned a harsh lesson and refuses to let his son repeat his mistakes. He believes he understands the world better now. He believes that love without equal status is dangerous, unstable, fragile. He believes that when money enters the picture, motives become questionable. And because he once felt discarded for lacking wealth, he now assumes that wealth will always be the deciding factor. Everything he does, spreading rumors, applying financial pressure, drawing hard lines, is rooted in that belief. It is not just about Tu Diep. It is about proving that he will never again be the poor man left behind. It is about ensuring that his family stands above vulnerability. Yet the irony is painful. In trying to protect his son from betrayal, he risks pushing him away. In trying to secure loyalty, he may fracture it. And in trying to control the future, he remains chained to the past. At its core, this is not simply a story about wealth and poverty or about two families standing on opposite sides of fortune. It is about unresolved pain shaping present decisions. It is about how humiliation can harden into suspicion and how suspicion can turn into extreme actions. Mr. Juan's fear of being betrayed again drives every move he makes. He cannot separate Tu Diep from her mother, cannot separate the present from memory. And until he confronts that old wound directly, every step he takes will be guided not by clarity, but by fear. In the end, all of his efforts to divide James and Tu Diep come down to one simple, powerful emotion. He is terrified of watching history repeat itself. This story uncovers the painful past that explains why Mr. Juan is determined to separate James from Tu Diep. Years ago, Mr. Juan deeply loved Mrs. Dieu, but she left him to marry a wealthy man, leaving him heartbroken and humiliated. Believing she chose money over love, he turned his pain into ambition and built a powerful, successful life. Now wealthy and influential, he sees history repeating itself when his accomplished son James falls in love with Tu Diep, the daughter of the woman who once abandoned him. Because Tu Diep comes from a poor background, Mr. Juan becomes convinced that she is only after James's fortune. Driven by unresolved bitterness and fear of betrayal, he spreads rumors, uses money to manipulate the situation, and forces James to choose between family and love, risking everything in the process.